But yeah, just to get the discussion started. So I think what was like really interesting is that we have now looked at metrics like from very different perspectives. We have looked at business metrics, we've looked at API metrics, and also like the development process metrics. But I think there are probably still like few companies who are just starting out building APIs, or they have APIs, but they're kind of like flying blind. And I think I would like to hear from you, like, what would be, like, from your perspective and your experience, what would be the point to get started? Like, what would be where you'd say, okay, if we want to have like a more data-driven approach to how to improve our API, how to improve our developer experience, like, what would be like the first thing to start?
Go first.
So I think it's contextual, and I think it depends on what your stakeholders are asking for. Like, I think I really liked your slides. Like, you know, is it money that they're asking for? Then, like, let's go check out conversions. Is it like less support? Then check out friction and things like that. So I would say there's not one. Well, that's an easy answer, right? But personally, I would say there's not one that I would bring to the top. I don't know, Meenakshi, if you have other ideas.
So I agree with you. It is a very. In the end, it just depends what kind of matrix you want to measure. So I really liked yours where it showed this nice graph of that these tiny dots are developers, but these are the communities. So in the end, if the business have matrix where it is not just about the revenue, but maybe it is to improve the life of the end users. We see really good ones like even from TomTom, they have maps. Google also have map API, but maybe they introduce maps, which is now is what you use on your cars, where you know that you're in the right location. So that is the kind of matrix. The end user here is the person sitting and driving, and not actually just BMW. So in that context, if the matrix is done from the reverse side, that this is the end user, then you can really define and break it down and say, okay, this is what we are actually looking for. Mm-hmm. So Daniel, do you have another opinion?
Well, some more thoughts here, perhaps. Yeah. So going to the basics of the question, which is kind of the very first step, I would say metrics are, so just by having metrics is a good first step to create awareness about who you are. From a process perspective, from an API consuming perspective, from many different perspectives. And at least by having those first step metrics, whatever they are, basically, you will understand who you are. Because sometimes I have the conversation of, we need to be faster to deliver software. But how fast are you? Well, I don't know. So then how do you know if you could be even faster, or perhaps you are not that slow, or perhaps you are really, really slow? So those really very first stage or early metrics in your process decision, in your decision-making process, it's kind of what I would say. So let's start discussing on the business goals, and then go for the metrics and see, okay, this is us. Now we have the room for improvement. Where are we in the map, in somehow?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Can I bring this to the audience? What metrics do you have? Yeah.
Actually, for the first metrics, we use like number of hits we receive, and we try to measure the availability of the APIs. That's, yes, a good big question of how do you define availability. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But this is the first metrics I will try to have.
Yeah. Other?
Yeah. Anyone else wants to share about their metrics?
Just a quick one. So I reached the conference a bit late, so I didn't get all the insight. And I'm very sad about that, just for you to know.
It's recorded, so you'll get it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm working for a Michelin company as a consultant, so we are in the development experience process to improve the experience over the APIs we are promoting. And we try to implement just past weeks the time to first call measurement, from the first subscription to an API to the first successful call on the system. we believe it will reflect somehow the easiness to use the products we are promoting. It will not give us insights on the quality of the documentation, on all the stuff that is next that time to first call, but I believe this is one which makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's like a really important metric. I'm seeing a lot of companies, they say this, like it's also often called like the time to hello world, like when will you get like the first API call done. And there's one model, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's like something like 3:30 or something, like you want people to like understand what your API, or like if they come to the developer, you want them to have like a rough idea of what it does in like 3 minutes or something, and then you want to have like the time like this. I don't remember the exact numbers, but you have these metrics where you say, okay, if developers are just getting started, how much time will it take before they can do something meaningful with your API? And I think that's a good way, and it's like a proxy metric for other things. But then, obviously, I mean, then you can go further than that.
I wonder how you would measure like the business persona or the technologist with their business hat on. How, like, what are the things you want to measure there? Because I think that's probably harder. Well, maybe you already are doing that.
Yes. Yeah. So in my current role, because I have just 40% of the stake on developer portal and APIs, I do have a KPI, which is a matrix for me, saying that, okay, we don't expect you that by end of this year you have launched 6 APIs, but we actually want you to map it and show us the numbers. We want to see the money increasing. So if your revenue is not growing there, then even if you launch the API, maybe it's not useful. So that KPI, that matrix, is actually linked more as a personal objective for me. And then it's passed on to the rest of the team to say that, okay, she's going to take care of the revenue. Developers, you need to make sure she can achieve that revenue. Make sure your documentation is correct. Your endpoints are working, because if it doesn't, then the whole team gets into trouble together. So that's one of the key things that I face it in my day-to-day job. Yeah.
I have a question for you. So have you seen specific actions that make a real impact in those numbers?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So just as you mentioned, so in the beginning, we had this action, and I just gave a soft KPI to the team, saying that, see, you have to help me get this. And I didn't explain them why, because it was attached to my personal objective. And then later on, when they started developing the API, then they realized that, okay, if we are going to give her this, she promises that we will get more solutions around that API to develop. And then later on, we may be able to establish a nice, fancy product, which we can build up as an SDK and develop something quite new. So then that was the action that came out, that one endpoint ended up being now a proper solution, which we just sell it to the customers out of the box. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But do you all have any other examples for non? Yeah.
I would like to ask it from the audience. Do you have any examples of stories where you had a metric that could show you that you actually made a business impact? Yes.
So to be clear, it is not a story for me, but for a team that I'm delivering for as an evangelist. So as part of a Michelin group, there is one company which is called Euromaster, who's intend to maintain cars. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenge of that company is to intermediate, to permit the leasers, the company that are leasing cars, and the e-retailers that are selling online tires to get appointment within your master garage in order for the end consumer to be able to get in an easy manner the rendezvous. Okay. So in the journey, the consumer journey, for someone who would like to buy the tires online, he's now able on some websites that are connected thanks to this API to get the tire, but as well the appointment on the Euromaster garage to have the tire mounted on the car. And in fact, few months after the release of that API and the implementation within that website, it has been seen that the cancellation rate, meaning the acquisition of the consumer having finalizing the buying of the tires, has decreased from 20% cancellation rate to 2%. So that means it has led 80% of new sales for that website. So it is an indicator. The challenge here is that it is difficult to measure because this is the consumer of the API who has that data. So there is this two-step information needed to get the insights. Okay, it's clear?
Other stories? Like anybody got an interesting story about like a complementary, like this was kind of a complementary API. So because the service is changing tires and this is an API that makes that easier. Any other stories of clear business impact that you've measured on APIs? Yeah. Thank you, Dani.
This is actually not a story about like when we calculated our business impact, but I've used to work for a big e-commerce company, so where we have obviously B2B for like B2B API for sellers who are loading the items on the platform, and they have asked, like, we tried to do some, UX interviews because we wanted to understand what they are like, why they are not, for what reason they want to use API, because they have other methods to load their items or receive information about the like loads or like delivery times and all that. And they surprisingly they have asked us for to calculate a metric for them. So it was like they asked from like for some payback point metric, from which, for example, amount of items or requests it makes sense to use an API or not the like manual operations or like XLS files to load all that. Like tell us how can we calculate from which point we will save some money on your APIs. But not like hiring people who will just manually do all the stuff in your UIs. And we like asked our business developers and business marketing guys, analytics, to calculate these payback points, like give like somewhat formula that we can give to the guys on the seller side, like our API potential API users, to calculate their payback point, like the point after which the API make more sense than manual operations, which was, I think, quite interesting case when not you are calculating your impact, but customer asks for this exact metric or formula or something.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we still have a few minutes. I wanted to bring something together, like we were talking about metrics, but we also talked about feedback earlier. And something I think you mentioned in your talk was like there's a quantitative matrix and there's qualitative matrix. And so you have numbers, but then you also have like just customers giving you feedback, and you don't yet have a number on it. So I'm curious, like what's a good way to combine these two things, feedback and metrics that can be expressed as numbers, to make some decisions, or like how do you bring these different things together? Again, that question is for all of you and whoever wants to answer.
I'll let Daniel. Do you have? You could start.
Oh, well, I can start. So again, my field of experience is, before we have all the services and everything, but when we are just so my experience in this case is not directly surveying or talking to customers, but talking to developers. and asking them about their processes, their way of working, and so on and so forth. So the way I mix both worlds is basically by confirming one or the other way. So perhaps we have certain hypotheses from the quantitative perspective, like, okay, it seems that the process is broken here, or there are several bottlenecks, or something happening there. So then we ask people, what's going on there? What do you think is happening? And then they give you the context. So basically, it's like you have the data skills, they bring the context, so suddenly you have like a storyline. You're a good storyteller because you are mixing both worlds. And the other way around. So basically, people may have certain perceptions that something is broken or not working as expected, and then you have data proving that. So data is another way, metrics specifically is another way of proving that something is wrong in the development process or the service that you are providing and so on. So did I answer the question?
I was just thinking about the thing that you had also in your presentation at the beginning, at the end, without data, you just have opinions. And I think what you just said is like the same thing, like the feedback can give you opinions and they can use the data to prove it. So I think that's like a good way to think of it.
Yeah. So the way I would answer the question is different because I come from a different domain.
Of course.
And I'll give an example here. So for us, in my earlier talk, I mentioned I work in a company where we manufacture payment cards. Now with the COVID, we did also face the supply problem, which was the chips. The chips were in shortage. So that is where, that's how then the qualitative and quantitative topic came across. Because on one hand side, we knew the quantity of the chips are going to be low. And we need to still give the payment cards to the banks because everyone suddenly became contactless. And I'm talking more from a German perspective where cash is still the king. But since 2 years, now all of a sudden people have started using contactless cards. So what happened with us is when this happened across the world, we realized, okay, how can we let our customers know that we have enough stock or we don't have stock? And what is then the trend of the upcoming stock in the warehouse? So the banks could then accordingly drive their end users to order or not to order more cards. That's where the matrix started to say we could give them quantitative data, and then the banks ended up giving the qualitative part by saying that instead of ordering the plastic card or your card is arriving, we'll immediately give you a virtual card so you can use it. And that is the way we started the combination. And now, after 2 years, this has been a success because now we have a nice fancy dashboard which shows the stocks. And on the other hand side, it helps us to balance the team in the warehouse who works in these operations. So they know that, okay, they still have 2-3 days to fulfill the stocks. And then in the end, when the sales come with their reviews on an quarterly basis, they have actually improved drastically. So COVID didn't impact us so much. In fact, the orders went higher and we could plan everything together. So that's how the matrix actually turned out. The last point here was, in the beginning, we didn't have API for this, but we realized it and then we quickly developed it and then used that API as a matrix to fulfill the rest of the stakeholders' needs. So sales were happy, top management happy, and we are happy. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to give you some space to pitch about inner sourcing, because I think you haven't had properly time to explain what that is, because I think it's interesting. I'll explain why it's interesting. I had a slide up about Jay Bloom, about the platform stuff. In that interview, he talks about it, that what would be a really, because I asked him about inner sourcing, and Danny will explain in a second. But he said that it would be really interesting to develop APIs and the services that are behind the API in an inner source way, kind of like open source, but inside of your enterprise. But in a way that you still have one team, the API team, that's running it and that's providing the service, but where the rest of the organization can collaborate with it. I kind of give it away, but so. Let me ask a different question.
Okay.
So inner sourcing is kind of like open source inside of your firewall, right? Inside of your enterprise. Now, how are metrics helping you with inner source? With helping organizations to develop better collaboration practices. How does that work? Like you gave some examples, but do you have like a practice for that, or how do you do that?
Yeah, I can bring, for instance, a public example with Santander Bank that is one of our customers. They have 4 different development teams across Europe. So that means Spain, Portugal, the UK, and Poland. And they had to develop a mobile app. And there are basically different ways of doing this, but the way they were doing this were, okay, we are producing one in Spain, and then we are taking this code, and then we move this to Poland, and then we do whatever in Poland, and then we have 2 different cores of the thing, and then you go to the UK, you have a 3rd one, and then you go to Portugal, and then you have a 4th one. So basically, you are reproducing once and again the code, and all the teams needed to develop and maintain and support, and give the service. So by inner source, basically what you are creating are silos of developers producing the same piece of code. And probably it makes sense that you have certain part of the software that is core, and then you have localizations to the different needs. For instance, in Spain, we have Bizum to pay between phones. You can send money. In Portugal, the name is different. In Germany and other places, probably you have another thing. So that's a localization of the technology. But all in all, everyone can send basically money through the phone to different places using the phone number. So by applying inner source, which is about breaking those silos of development, enabling developers from different countries to contribute to each other, to collaborate with each other, to influence the roadmap by bringing different requirements, to the product owners and everything. Basically, you are building like one app at the level of Europe, and then you are localizing this to the rest of the countries, and then of course you can extend this to the rest of the world, if that makes sense. So with inner source specifically, one of the part of the business case, what they discovered is that they were like around 30% more efficient, basically money or time, than if they were applying this country by country. So that's kind of the highlight, I would say, with certain impact.
So I understood. So is it like open source, or how?
So inner source is not about it's not open source.
Okay.
But you are. So again, if you think about the different countries, you have 4 different ways of producing software. But from a micromanagement perspective, agile way of producing software, yeah, the countries are producing great software. The countries are producing great things because they are providing the service that they are expected to provide. From a macro level perspective, what happens is that you are not reusing code, and you're producing once and again the same piece of software, right? Because people don't collaborate with each other, because the product owners, they want to have their own kingdom in somehow,
yes.
Right? So how can we break those silos? Inner source is about this. So where else in the world basically are people geographically distributed producing code in an effective way? Open source. So it's about bringing that methodology and that way of working, those principles, internally to corporations. So this is mainly a cultural shift. So we are thinking of, we are in corporations with strong ownership, with certain ways of developing software, and we have to move them into ways of developing software that are based on sharing, because that's open source. Open source is about sharing, meritocracy is about building communities. So that change, that's basically inner source, and mainly is a cultural shift, then mainly process, and then of course tools. Mm-hmm.
Very practically, so instead of having to go to your manager, who goes to the manager, who goes to their manager, who goes back to their manager, who gets the code actually implemented, you do pull request. Like, can you add this feature to your code so that your tool actually works for me? That's the idea.
Yeah, and what happens typically, and we have some examples with some companies, that if you ask a team to develop something to another team, just sharing an empty file, try to do this internally, it has taken more than a month and more than 20 different steps. So there is a lot of friction in this process. If you compare this to the open source world, perhaps CNCF community, pull request is accepted in less than 1 day in average. So, question?
I have one question. Yes, excuse me, I have one question about that, because if it means that you are working with developers that are hired internally, or you are working with contractors? Both of them. And some contractors, they accept to do pull requests on the code of other contractors, because sometimes there is like conflict of interest there. They don't want others to know or give some knowledge.
Yeah, that you are totally right, and that heavily depends on the industry. So, for instance, automotive industry. We have certain experience there, and our experience tells us that you have outsourced companies that are providing code. Sorry, they are not providing the code. They are giving you the binary. They are not giving even access to their internal processes. They are giving you a document with the processes they followed. So, yeah, in that sense, basically, there is no way that you can have a look at whatever they are producing. They are giving you a binary. In the case of the other industries, for instance, banking, of course, highly regulated environment, but after all, there is certain room to discuss with the outsourced companies and say, okay, we want to do this, we want to proceed in this way. Our experience says, yeah, they say that's all right, because basically the one paying is asking them to behave in this way. But I don't know if you... Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we'll have to wind up this discussion now, because it's already 20 minutes past 3, and that's, I think, the official break time. So again, thank you all for your talks. Thank you all for being here. And yeah, I think now we have like half an hour break, and afterwards there will be more talks on the area of developer experience in this room, as well as all the other tracks. So hope you have a good rest of the day here at API Days.
Thank you.
Thank you.